Libya in 1948 had 38,000 Jews. Today, there are 0. Iraq, 150,000 Jews in 1948, 3 today. So it's a very, very sad comment about what I call the ethnic cleansing of Jews from the Arab world.
Welcome to The Honest Take, the show that goes past the headlines to find out what's actually true about Israel and the people covering it. I'm Ben Chertoff. You've heard the word Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe of 1948. But there's a second exodus from the same moment in history that almost no one talks about. In 2009, a professor in Miami went looking through Steven Spielberg's archive of Holocaust testimonies, 52,000 interviews. He found fewer than 100 from Jews of the Arab world. A whole civilization. The Talmud was written in Babylon, the Zohar in Moorish Spain, and the last witnesses were going silent. So he started recording. Hundreds of interviews covering the Farhud in Baghdad, Operation Magic Carpet out of Yemen, Ezra and Nehemiah out of Iraq, families who rented their home to a king and left with nothing. He calls it Sephardi Voices, and he argues that you cannot honestly talk about one refugee story of 1948 without telling the other. He's testified before Congress, he's taken the case to the United Nations, and his latest book puts a number on what was lost. Dr. Henry Green, welcome to The Honest Take.
Thank you for inviting me.
So you grew up an Ashkenazi kid in Ottawa, and by your own admission, you, and I'm quoting, knew close to nothing about Sephardic Jews. Then you land in Israel in the early 1970s in the middle of the Black Panther protests. What did you walk into and what cracked open when you got there?
So I go to Israel to study I do a master's in sociology, and I'm totally ignorant of the Sephardi, but there's a Black Panther protest movement, and I think I'm supporting civil rights, and I go to the protest movement, and it's about second-generation Sephardi, Moroccans in particular, saying they've been discriminated in Israel. So first, I'm surprised about discrimination in Israel. That's not the message that I got. And then that you have this other population of Jews that come from the Arab world that no one's told me anything about. Slowly, I begin to learn about that Israel is made up of two major populations, one from the European world and one from the Arab world.
Let's fast forward to 2009 when you founded Sephardi Voices. What was the impetus that led to this?
So I had been director of Jewish studies at the University of Miami for many years, and I had stepped away from that and wanted to work on another project. And I thought, well, I'm interested in the Sephardi. What about Holocaust testimonies of Jews who were displaced from the Arab lands? So what I did is I went and looked at the Shoah collection at the University of Southern California, where Spielberg had placed 52,000 interviews. And what I found was that there were less than 100 interviews of Jews who experienced the Holocaust in the Arab world. And there was a major event called the Farhud, which is a horrible riot against Jews in Baghdad in 1941 on Shavuos. So I made a decision, from Pirkei Avot, if not now, when? And it was not to collect the story of the Holocaust survivors from the Arab world. It was to tell the story of the million Jews who were displaced from the Arab world, and to really tell their stories from the establishment of the State of Israel until more or less the Iranian Revolution.
For a listener who's never heard of the numbers involved here. Roughly 850,000 Jews displaced from the Arab world and Iran. Can you set the scene? What were the communities like? How old were they? What was it like there?
So when I think of the North Africa and the Middle East, I think of the Jews as being indigenous peoples. And they, in many, many ways, built the base of how we understand things in terms of Judaism. So, for example, how do you talk about Babylon without talking about the Talmud? And the Talmud is the major interpretation. How do you talk about Jewish mysticism without talking about the Zohar? And the Zohar was written in Spain under the Moors.
These are communities, I mean, for instance, the Jewish community in Baghdad was, until the middle of the 20th century, one of the oldest continuously functioning civilizations in humanity. Is that, am I wrong in that interpretation?
No. The story of the Jews in Iraq, what's Babylon, Iraq, a person would call themselves today, if they came from Baghdad, they would say, I'm a Babylonian Jew, which says something about their identity, how far back it goes.
Yeah.
They don't say I'm Iraqi, they say I'm Babylonian. Right. Indeed, the Sephardi community, the Jews from Arab lands, if you take communities like Baghdad, have been there for a long time, extremely thriving. In the 1920s, the Minister of Finance was a Sephardic Jew.
And these communities completely gone now.
Yeah. So let's take Libya, for example. Libya in 1948 had 38,000 Jews. Today, there are 0. If you take Iraq, 150,000 Jews in 1948, 3 today. So it's a very, very sad comment about what I call the ethnic cleansing of Jews from the Arab world.
I think the numbers would definitely support that description. When you decided to put together this project and record these stories, walk me through an interview. How does that work? How do you find them? What was it like sitting down with all these people?
So what I did is I would go to people who were, let's say, from Iraq or Morocco or Libya, and I would say, okay, I've heard about you. Who else could I interview? And they would send me to their friends or their relatives. And then they would say, for example, well, 1948 is important, but there was a war in 1967. You should get some of those people because it's different. Or there was a war in 1973. And so how did that impact these people because of the historical event that was going on that very much resulted in Jews who lived in these countries being attacked because of what Israel was doing, winning a war, as it were. So the reason why it's so important to understand this is that because the European Jewish community was so small, what happened is post-1600, when Jews were thrown out of Spain and Portugal, and they come to the Americas, and they go to Europe, what we end up having is the story of those European Jews coming to America. So 250,000 Jews lived in the United States in 1880. By the end of World War I, you now have several million. So the stories we are learning always are the stories of the European Jews and the Tsars and what happened in Germany and on and on and on. But the Sephardi are having really, for the most part, a much better life in these Arab worlds because they were considered as dhimmi. They were considered as protected citizens because they believed in God. And so, okay, you had to ride on a mule instead of a horse. Your synagogue couldn't be as tall, but you could practice your religion. You could build a synagogue.
Right.
You could have Passover. You could have the events that said, I am a Jew, and feel proud about that. And there were bad times and good times, but there was never a crusade. There was never a policy in the Islamic world that said, like Christianity, that Jews killed Jesus, that Jews killed God. Instead, it was good times. Well, you're the merchants. Good times, you could be an advisor. Bad times was different. But it wasn't ever a policy that said Jews were bad.
A lot of that depended on who was in charge at a given time, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, the geopolitics change in one way or the other. And so you do have movement here and there. But generally speaking, when the Inquisition happened, let's say in 1492, sure, some Jews went to Italy, but the overwhelming majority of Jews went to the Ottoman Empire or back into North Africa. Well, why would you go to an Islamic state if you did not feel you'd be more safe than going into a Catholic world? That's my point.
So what happened? How did that change? You mentioned the Farhud in 1941. In the Mandate of Palestine, there's the Arab riots in 36, the Hebron massacre in 29. What shifted?
Well, there were three different things that I would bring to explain that. The first and the most important is that the Ottoman Empire is falling apart. And the Ottoman Empire basically controlled a lot of Eastern Europe. They controlled the Middle East and a lot of North Africa. So what the Western powers wanted was to be able to get to the oil, to get to the gas, in order to move forward with their economies. And so they saw the Ottoman Empire as weak. And when World War I came between the Ottomans and the Germans, they were the bad guys, and the West were the good guys. The Brits and French went to the tribes, the Bedouin tribes, and said, look, if you help us, we will help create a nation state for you. And so the fall of the Ottoman Empire led to the establishment of many of these nation states that we know about in various kinds of ways. And the Brits and the French, though, unfortunately, were not very righteous in what they were doing. They, for example, said in the Sykes-Picot treatment in 1916, if you help us to the Bedouin tribes, we will help make you a nation state. Then the following year, they work with the Jews and set up the Balfour Declaration that says that we are in favor of a Jewish homeland. So they're promising to both. Right. And then what happens is that the war is won, and many of these colonies begin to arise in different kinds of ways, with much more ability to be a territory of the Western power. So you have Libya becoming a territory of Italy pre-World War I, just pre-World War I. You have Morocco and Tunisia becoming a territory of France. So after the war, the Brits choose the Faisal family to become the heads of Saudi Arabia. And a member of the family is upset because he didn't get something. So they make him the king of Iraq. But what they sort of miss in doing that is that Iraq is more a Shia population tied to Iran rather than a Sunni population tied to Saudi Arabia. So they've put a Sunni now in charge of a Shia population. And so World War I is one big reason that things will fall apart, is because the Shia and the Sunni are not that friendly, number one, and that the states that are being set up are really territories in which they've promised to one Bedouin tribe, one family, that they will be able to dominate. So instability comes out of that in various kinds of ways. Number two, because they've set up the Balfour Declaration, the Brits, and Zionism is beginning to take hold after World War I, founded in 1896, and that first Zionist Congress, 1898. So what happens is that the Zionists begin moving forward post-World War I, especially in establishing the infrastructure for what would become the State of Israel. And so you end up having Palestinian populations, the two minority groups now under the Brits who control Palestine, the Jewish, Arab, which is both Christian and Muslim, and other groups that are living in Palestine, wanting to be able to move forward with whatever their idea of a state is. So that creates instability. And the third reason has to do with Europeanization, because when you colonialized the let's say Marrakesh or Casablanca or Tripoli or it doesn't matter, Baghdad, what you did was you began to lay the seeds of secularization and European culture. And the people who most took advantage of that was the Jews, because they viewed it as a way to be economically productive, to be able to move within European culture, and of course, for people who were more rural or people who did not have those same benefits in terms of their abilities, it put the Jews in a more precarious position as time continued.
Let's get concrete if we can. When the state turns on its Jews, what did that look like on the ground? Obviously, different states had different degrees of expulsion, but the citizenship laws, the property seizures, the jizya tax, the arrests, what did that look like for Jews on the ground?
Well, here's the first thing you have to appreciate. When one talks about Jews in the Arab world, one cannot make statements that create uniformity. What happens in Iraq is different than Morocco, which is different than Libya. So I was going to just give you a little sense of various things. In my book, for example, here's a guy named Moshe Liba. And so he's a person who lived in Benghazi in Libya. And so I want to take you sort of from the Holocaust, okay? So he says, he's talking about the Germans. There was a pogrom in Benghazi taking place in the streets. We were children inside the house. We barricaded the doors. We were scared to death that something would happen to us. My father was taken to a concentration camp. We were suffering from malnutrition. The ration was a half a loaf of bread per person per day. Over a year, every night bombs fell. When I hear people talking about PTSD, I say to myself, I went through that.
Can you imagine taking those landing craft because the ships could not come close to shore, and then they had those big ropes, nets made from ropes, and you have to climb. You probably saw it, how the soldiers do it. Can you imagine children? And my grandmother was close to 80 years old, climbing these things, but out of desperation, do everything. We didn't have anything. There was no need. We didn't have suitcases. We didn't have anything. Just we left with our clothing. But one thing we had was the jewelry that my father was able to. He was able to. He had a can that was for oil. And I don't know how he did it, but he put everything in. So this can was the only belonging. And he made clear that it should look dirty and oily and greasy. Nobody would even touch it. And we were carrying that was the only thing that we were carrying.
So the first thing that I want to really, really strongly comment on is that the Nazis were in North Africa.
Right.
They were in Baghdad. The Farhud that I mentioned is a Nazi riot where they're killing Jews in the Mela, in the ghetto, and the British aren't helping. Right. So the Jewish experience during the Nazi times was one of a kind of wake-up call. They thought they were separate from what was happening in Europe, but that Europeanization process also affected them. And I think one has to appreciate that as that is moving on, so too is what happens post-World War II when the world is trying to make some order and so they can't resolve Palestine. So the United Nations in 1947 says, in November 29th, we're going to set up two states, a Palestinian state and a Jewish state. So the various countries that were trying to respond to Nazism, they also were responding to Nazism in terms of their own future. They wanted their own nation state. And so the countries that were colonizing them, they responded to those countries in ways that very much affected the Jews. So, for example, in Algeria, are you with us in the revolution? Are you against us? Well, in Algeria, Jews are French citizens. And so they're called Pieds Noirs, and they wanted to remain French citizens. So therefore, you're considered to be a fifth column. You're considered to be the bad guys.
Right.
So what I'm trying to suggest to you, you can't be uniform. Okay,
right.
That's my number one point. And then as these countries are trying to break up in different ways, and apart from the colonizer, you take somewhere like Baghdad. And so you have someone like Abdullah Dangour. Abdullah Dangour was born before the British came across the Tigris-Euphrates. And so Abdullah Dangour says, I watched the British come across the river, and I thought this was freedom for us. And sure, the British took over Iraq, and I just said to you, they brought in a king, and the Jews in Baghdad, it was like the Jews of New York, the Jews of Alexandria 2,000 years ago in Egypt. What a great life. And then Israel becomes a state in 1948, and immediately Iraq makes the decision that they're going to join Jordan and Lebanon and Egypt and attack Israel. And all the Jews who are living in Iraq at this point are now viewed as bad guys, are viewed as the enemy.
But the situation, it seems like, had been deteriorating for a little bit. The Farhud was in 1941. Am I wrong in that? That understanding? It wasn't like overnight.
No, but there's always like waves of good and bad. So when you think of Iraq becoming an independent country after World War I, the Jews are about 35-40% of Baghdad. They're the finance minister. They're
a huge part of the economy.
Part of
what I read in your book. I was surprised to see how big a part of Baghdad.
Oh my God! It's not just the economy. The Fawidi brothers, they fused Arab music with Western music, and so it's cultural, it's economic, it's political. They are the pillars in many ways of what Baghdad society is about. Zilka, the family Zilka, they set up banking in Iraq, which they then spread to Lebanon and throughout the Middle East. So it wasn't just in terms of the country. They were taking their ideas and they were exporting it, if I could say it in that kind of way, in terms of banking, in terms of culture, in terms of music, and you see this all over the place. When the Ottoman Empire was falling, many Jews decided to leave, and they went to Cairo because Cairo was a cosmopolitan city post World War I, and you had Italians and you had Greeks, and so again, the Jews were the cinema industry in the Middle East began in Cairo by Jews. I mean, you look at culture, you look at banking, you look at economy. I mean, I gave you Cairo as an example. I gave you Baghdad. Well, one's in Africa, one's in the Middle East. You know, and it's so these people are also connected because of relatives, because these people are marrying within their religion. They're not intermarrying. So the names, if you take certain names, oh yeah, you can just trace it by DNA. So if you go from Morocco all the way to Baghdad, you're going to have the same traditions. When you learn Torah, you're going to hold it vertically. If you go in the Ashkenazi world, you do it horizontally. You're going to eat rice for Pesach, where in the Ashkenazi world, you're not going to eat rice for Pesach. So what I'm trying to get at here is that if you look at economy, if you look at culture, if you look at banking, if you look at food, it's very unified. And these families, because they have been in the Middle East a long time, the Moshe Lavi, for example, who I just read a quote from, his family, 500 years, he goes back to them being rabbis. So it's a historical presence that they feel and are very, very proud of. And if I go back to the story of Dangoor who saw the British cross the river, and then he leaves in the 1960s. And when I asked him in the interview, my last question is always, well, how do you identify yourself? And so what does he say? He says, well, I'm British. I've lived here 60 years. But then he says, how can I deny that I'm Iraqi? I've lived there for 3,000 years.
We used to tell the Muslim friends, we used to tell them, we are here before you. We have more right than you have. But how can I deny that I'm an Iraqi? I didn't go there as an immigrant. I've been there for 3,000 years.
And it says something about their identity and how that culture has not gone away, that it's very, very much part of who they are.
And it wasn't only Jews getting kicked out who lost a significant amount. The economies of Baghdad, the culture of Baghdad lost that Jewish influence. And really, I was surprised to make that connection. I shouldn't have been, but that they took a hit from that.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that, is argued about all the time. It's that what is the loss to these communities that lost their Jews? And like many, many countries, what happens is that the people who are more educated, the people who are more cosmopolitan, if things are going badly, they leave and find another place. It's called push and pull. You're pushed out because of persecution or there's no jobs, and you go somewhere where you have religious freedom or there's jobs. And so who's leaving? The Jews are leaving because it's not only their assets are taken away, and synagogues and community centers. It's, I really have no future. And so where am I going to go? I got to go somewhere. And most of these people were not given citizenship in these countries,
right,
because they weren't Muslim. And so they had French citizenship or they had Italian citizenship. And Israel, of course, one of their major agendas was to bring the scattered seeds of Jews everywhere back to Israel. And so Jews, because they were more educated, more cosmopolitan, would then use the situation to go to these countries or to go to Israel. But again, let's not be monolithic. There were Jews who lived in the Atlas Mountains. Atlas Mountains are near Marrakesh. And they were very, very illiterate, poor, and they ended up, in part because of their messianic theology, going to Israel. And they were the ones, especially when they went to Israel, they were heavily discriminated against because they didn't have the education. They looked like Arabs, and they spoke Arabic. And that's part of when we began the conversation of the protest movements, because these were the ones who were especially discriminated against.
Let's get into the stories of the actual rescues that are incredibly cinematic in how they went down. I mean, as I'm reading through your book, I'm thinking there's so many films that that need to be made of this. But Operation Magic Carpet out of Yemen, Operation Ezra and Nehemiah out of Iraq, these are tens of thousands airlifted in months. What were those operations really like? What did the people who were on it say about them?
So these were Mossad operations, which had to do with both saving the Jews as well as bring them to Israel, because Israel's population in 1948 was 650,000 Jews. And so they needed Jews to come to Israel, and the European Jews really were not coming, the American Jews. And so they turned to the Sephardi to come and build Israel. It was not Israel's first choice. It had to do with what happened after 48. And so you take Iraqi Jews. So there's a guy named Shlomo Hillel who was Iraqi, had gone to Israel pre-World War II, and he was chosen to go and bring the Jews from Iraq to Israel. So what he did was he began immediately after World War II going to Baghdad and beginning to train high school students in the use of arms so that they would be able to defend themselves. These high school students did not tell their parents. They would be in the basement with this guy showing them how you take a gun apart and how you put it together. And then what would happen is that there's two stories about this. We don't know which one to go with. There's the Israeli story, and then there's the non-Israeli story. So the Israelis wanted to scare the Babylonian population, the Jewish population, that they had to leave. Because even though the Iraqi government was taking away their assets and saying you can't do this or that, and in fact, one person who was a leader in the community, they hung, and so they were setting the signals that you're no longer welcome here. But it's a big decision to pick up yourself and leave. So what the story is that Mossad blew up a synagogue. Now, the view also is that it was the Iraqis that did it. But the result of that was that many felt that it is no longer safe to be there. And then the Iraqi government said, through a negotiation with the Israeli government, that if we let them go, you give us $100 a person and they can leave. And so they told people within the community to sign a form, more or less, and list their assets, and they would be able to leave. And then, of course, when they left, and this was the Operation Ezra and Nehemiah, where planes came in and flew them to Cyprus. They couldn't come straight to Israel. From Cyprus to Israel, then the Iraqi government, which had promised that they would just be holding their assets until they got back, they then took all their assets. And then many, many years later, you have stories that are just unbelievable movie stories where someone like, I'm going to tell you two stories. One story is Lisette Shashua. So Lisette Shashua, her grandfather turned out that he had one of the better homes along the Tigris. And so when the king came, who had been appointed, he had nowhere to live. So Lisette Shashua's grandfather, for $1 a year, rented his home to the king. Now, that says something about how respected the Jews were in Baghdad in the 1920s. So here is Lisette. She goes to a school called Frank Inni because what happened in Baghdad was that after 48 and Iraq fighting against Israel, Jews mostly had left, about 135,000 of the 150. So there was one Jewish school called Frank Inni, and everyone went to that school. And unlike other schools, they learned Arabic, French, English, as well as Hebrew. And they had to write exams when they finished high school in the baccalaureate in French, the Arab exam, and the A-levels in English. So they're very highly educated, these people. Very highly educated. Lisette Shashua goes to university. And she's in university in 1967. And she's on campus when the war is happening, and her phones are cut off. There's no contact with her parents, who she's going to try to get to. And she finally decides that the only thing she can do is leave. So she dresses up as a Muslim woman, goes up to the Kurdish area, and escapes to Iran. Edwin Shuker, same kind of story. He basically escapes in 1970, goes to the Kurdish area, and escapes to Iran. Now, Edwin ends up in England, and Lisette ends up in Canada. Now, why do I mention these two stories? Because the feelings towards the Muslims are very different. It is very, very common for people who leave Iraq because their assets are taken, because they played such a strong contribution, like Lisette's grandparents, to be very bitter in terms of what happened. On the other hand, Edwin Shuker, who also lost his home, who also had to escape to go to the Kurdish area and then be driven across, and who knows if you would live or die. In his case, he views it as an opportunity today to build relationships with the Arabs. And so he becomes one of the people who is the future thinkers of the Abraham Accords. So he, in fact, has bought a place in Dubai, thinking that this is a way of reaching out because I know the culture, I speak the language, I have friends. So the experience is one of, if you take it from, say, the 1920s, when it was a very rich life, to the 1950s, when it totally breaks down, it's very different for the people who live that life and tell the stories.
Right.
Very, very different depending on who it is. And it's also different for each country, because Iraq, it's in the early 1950s, where in Morocco, it's more the late 1960s, where the population that is more educated, not the ones in the Atlas Mountains, but the ones who are living in Casablanca or living in Marrakesh, where they are more educated. So when I think of these kinds of stories, I then try to understand, when is it happening and what country? So let me give you another example. Eddie Cohn. Eddie Cohn comes from Lebanon. And here's a little quote for him. I'm a Jew, and as a Jew, I am guilty. And what is my fault? I have two main charges. First, for the Christians, you, Eddie, killed Jesus. And Muslims would say to me, you stole Palestine. Girls do not want to talk to me because I'm Jewish. Their parents do not allow them to speak or deal with the Jews. As a kid, it's very troubling. You don't know what you've done. So here's this guy growing up in the 1980s in Beirut, okay? And he knows he's a Jew. He's being discriminated against. And his father is taken by, let's call it the Hezbollah, and they kill him.
Right.
And so he's now put in the position of what does he do? How does he get out of Beirut? And so it takes him a while, and finally he's able to leave Beirut. He goes to France, and then is able to get his mother and family out, and then comes to Israel after France and lives there. You take a family like, take Algeria as if I could talk about Algeria for a second.
Sure.
So you have Emile Diane. Emile Diane is a French citizen who lives in Algeria, and he fights in World War I to help the French. He has a son named Charles, and Charles, he fights in World War II to help the French. His troop is conquered in Germany. They have to strip to be cleaned and whatever, and they see he's circumcised. And so the Germans say, you're Jewish. But his commander, who's not Jewish, says, no, none of these people are Jewish. And so he lives. He goes back to Algeria. He has nothing. And he doesn't know where he can go because as an Algerian, he wants to be French. And he just fought for the French. But the Muslims are saying, well, if you're not with us, you're against us. And so he ends up having to leave in 1962 with Ghislaine, his wife. They come to France. His daughter, Elisa, what happens to her? She grows up in France. She starts having children and realizes that France is becoming increasingly anti-Semitic. And I'm trying to see if I have a little quote from her here. She says, so it's not politically correct to say that there are places in the suburbs of Paris and even some places in Paris where you can't go if you're Jewish. I had young guys telling me that I was a whore, a dirty Jew whore.
I felt that I didn't want to live there. I don't want my daughters to be raised there because I couldn't even dress like this. It was dangerous to, as a woman, to be walking, and still there's areas of Paris being a woman, not Muslim. It's you don't feel safe at all. I'm a French Jew. That became an American, and I want to stay here, try to integrate. It's not easy because, like I said, after 10 years, I still have people asking me if I'm a tourist here. So I guess all my life I'm going to be an immigrant. But maybe my daughters won't feel the same way.
What she is saying is that anti-Semitism that was in Europe, and she's now talking about, the 21st century. She's also, and the people I interview are not really talking about anti-Semitism. They're talking about anti-Israel. It's very different. Because if the Jewish community is feeling comfortable in the Arab world, in Cairo and Baghdad, they're not having to deal with a Jewish state. But when that Jewish state comes, then these countries bring in systematic discrimination. And that systematic discrimination then ends up making it impossible for these people to live, or they will be killed. They will be literally killed. And so you end up having the Israeli government coming in and trying to help get them out. And so you have the Ezra and Nehemiah, you have the magic carpet in Yemen, etc. But as time continues, there are less and less Jews, and then they become prisoners in the state, and they're not able to leave. And that's
Right.
why people like Lisette or Edwin are figuring out a way of, how can I bribe someone? How can, if I dress up like a Muslim, where do I go that I can then be able to be safe? And that is the challenge, and that's the trauma they have. All these
Right.
people are traumatized. They have PTSD. And the question is then, why are some more resilient than the others?
I was struck by one of your examples. I think it was Edwin Shakur who had moved to and was living in the UK and makes a point about seeing somebody in uniform and all these years later getting that fear that he had gotten because of trying to escape from Iraq through Kurdish, I guess would now be Kurdistan. And he's in the UK. You wrote this before October 7th.
Before October 7th, yeah.
Have you been in contact with him post October 7th with this explosion of anti-Semitism in the UK? Because here's somebody who has fled from one place to another place to another place.
Yeah, it's very different when you talk to different people. Edwin's view is very different than many of the Jewish people in the United Kingdom. His view is that he can be an ambassador, as it were, in bringing a different perspective, and that's why I'm saying he has this home in Dubai. He also bought a home in Ibril in Iraq.
I saw that, yeah.
I mean, so he's a very different kind of person. His view is that what we need to do is to understand that a lot of this anti-Semitism in Europe is not the same in the Arab world. And this is what I've been trying to comment on, that the Jews were kicked out of England in 1290, and Shakespeare's writing 300 years later about the Merchant of Venice, and he's never met a Jew.
Right.
So there is this perception in Europe, and in terms of anti-Semitism, which is European, which is very different than the perception of discrimination and anti-Semitism in the Arab world. It's so much connected to the establishment of the State of Israel and the various wars that have, evolved.
I mean, there was some crossover, though. I mean, the Haj Amin Husseini in spending most of the war in Berlin, the many translations of Mein Kampf into Arabic, the Muslim Brotherhood and its connection to Nazi ideology. I mean, I guess that's more of a specific group as opposed to the society as a whole. Is that the difference?
Well, there's again, I keep trying to emphasize this, that every country is different.
Of
So
course, right.
So let's use that example, and then use the King of Morocco. So the King of Morocco, when the Nazis come, says, "Where are your Jews?" And his answer is, "I have no Jews. I only have Moroccans." So I'm giving you an example of what happened in Baghdad or Iraq, and giving you an example of Morocco. And we can't conflate them in the same way, and that if you took a look at the waves of people who were ethnically cleansed, then the ones in Iraq, 135,000 with this Operation Nehemiah, Ezra, whatever, Ezra Nehemiah, that's happening in the early 1950s, okay? But the Moroccans, except for the Atlas Mountains, they're staying around until post-67.
Right.
Okay, very different. It's a period of the 6-Day War changed everything. But today, the Moroccans have a treaty with Israel under the Abraham Accords, And they actually teach now Holocaust in their schools in Morocco. Where in Iraq, it's just a matter of time where there will be no Jews, and yet you had this continuous history going back to the time of Jeremiah. So all I'm trying to suggest is that if you look at it in terms of the decrees that happened to Jews in these countries, which is Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Iraq, and Iran, these countries, okay? It's the same. Denationalization.
Right.
Loss of assets, okay? And you can just list one after the other. But in how this was put into practice and how people felt the trauma or the PTSD, it's very different. And so when you get in my book, when you read my book, Sephardi Voices, you'll hear so many stories of people who have really suffered in all kinds of ways. And these stories can be very late. Eddie Cohn, 1980s, his father being kidnapped and killed. It's not the 1950s. This is the 1980s. And Lebanon was viewed as a more safe place for Jews, than Iraq. But the bottom line is that why would 1 million people leave in a period of 30 years?
Right.
And that is ethnic cleansing when you put it in the context of the decrees of assets taken, synagogues taken, cemeteries taken, made into parking lots, denationalization. And you just go one after the other, and that's consistent. And that's what Jews had to face.
How come nobody has heard of this? I mean, is it not only is there no refugee organization for all these Jews who were kicked out? Not only is there really had there not been any recognition on the global stage, but like even Jews, even Ashkenazi Jews, we didn't know this story. I didn't until very recently. Why is that? You pointed out the term Ashkenormativity, which...
Well, I think from my understanding, I think it has to do with a few things. First and foremost is that Israel was so challenged in 1948. They had no resources. They just had to survive somehow. And so what they wanted to do was to be able to build a perimeter of safety. And so they began building different cities like Dimona or Kiryat Shmona in the north, these various places. And so they sent their pioneers, as it were, these new immigrants to these places. But there were no resources, no teachers, no schools. So what happened was you ended up being more discriminated against. And when it came to to finding jobs, people were put into refugee camps. There was tents. But someone from Tel Aviv would go to the camp and say, I need a worker. Well, that person from Europe spoke Yiddish. But the one that came from the Arab world spoke Arabic, or spoke Ladino, or spoke Hakatiya from northern Morocco. So you didn't have the same opportunity. So what happened was you stayed in the camps much longer. The average for an Ashkenazi was 6 months. For a Sephardi was 18 months. So in terms of education, in terms of a future, that first generation that lived in Israel was discriminated against because Israel didn't have the institutional resources, and they were the weaker on the chain, if you put it that way. And then the other part of it, of course, was that Israel was basically an Ashkenazi country, and so they were using European, and they also, when a person walked down the street and they were dressed like an Arab from I don't know, Morocco, and they spoke Arabic, and they were maybe not as light in skin color, then you were afraid that this was an Arab. And so they really, really suffered a great degree of discrimination, which then brings you back to the protests. Okay. Then what happened is Israel basically made a policy that everyone would be a new Israeli. So there's a wonderful story about Danny Ayalon. Danny Ayalon was the Israeli ambassador to America. He was the deputy foreign minister. And so his children come to him and they say to him, "Who am I? Who are we?" And so he says, "Well, you're Israeli. You're the new Israeli. You know, oh my God, we're so blessed after 2,000 years." And they go like, "Yeah, but who are we? Who are we?" So they have to go to the grandparents. And the grandparents say, "Well, we're Algerian." And they go, "What? Am I an Arab Jew? How is that possible?" And you have the story of Cynthia Kaplan. She's from Iraq. She's in America. She marries an Ashkenazi. Her kids, they come to their bar mitzvah and say, "Okay, tell me about my history." "Well, I'm an Arab Jew." No, no, no. There are no Jews in the Arab world. So what happened was that Israel was challenged. And then the educational system, both in Israel and diaspora, didn't teach about Jews from Arab lands because they wanted the new Israeli. And so only it began to surface really in the 21st century when you had second, third generation, the integration. Ashkenazi was now marrying Sephardi, where you had the Oslo Accords moving forward. There was the sense now that, okay, let's bring this larger history to bear. But in terms of the diaspora, and I really want to emphasize this, the diaspora is about 90% Ashkenazi and about 10% Sephardi, in the United States, let's say. Mostly concentrated in places like Los Angeles, where you have a very large Persian community. New York, you have a Syrian plus other communities. So you are always a minority within a minority. And what Jews want is one voice. And so you don't have the luxury of saying, "Oh, we have this kind of history. We have these kinds of issues." And so the Ashkenazi leadership in America in particular has not advocated for the Sephardi. In 2014, the Israeli government passed a new law that you would have Yom HaPlitim, means Refugee Day for the Sephardi. Okay? We have Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Day. In 2015, it was passed, it was launched by President Rivlin in his house. I was there for the event. And in the last 10 years, how many Jewish communities celebrate Holocaust Day? I would say everyone.
Right.
How many celebrate Yom HaPlitim or even have heard of it? Which says something about Ashkenazi leadership. It's a law passed by the Knesset. They celebrate it in Israel every year. Why is Ashkenazi leadership, why are our communities not having it? And my view on this is, gee, how hard is this? You bring a Holocaust survivor to class for a Holocaust Day. Why can't you bring a person who survived and became a member of your community in New York, wherever you are, in a Jewish school, and the child or the grandchild will take such pride in hearing their parent or grandparent speak. You can show some video and then have this event to honor the people who left the Arab world.
In 2007, you testified before the Congressional Human Rights Caucus. What were you asking the U.S. government to do then? What actually came of it? What are you working on now in terms of that sort of recognition?
So the organization that's been the number one advocate for the ethnic cleansing of Jews from the Arab world is called JJAC, Justice for Jews from Arab Countries. with its leader, CO Stan Ehrman. And so he arranged for this meeting in Congress. And the idea was to get the American government to take a position regarding the expulsion of Jews from the Arab world. And it also had to do with in the Iraqi war, they found thousands of documents that were in the intelligence building and had been brought back to the States. And so the idea was to have Congress make a statement so these documents, these papers, Siddurim, Torah scrolls could remain in the States. So it was to get the government of America behind this, not only keeping the documents, but to be able to deal with issues like reparations, etc. And that really did not go anywhere, but there were Congress people like Ilyana Ros-Letnin, who was chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, who was extremely supportive of it. And so when we had this opportunity in September of 2025 to put it in front of the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, Stan, myself, a few others, went to Geneva and put this now on the international United Nations agenda, that just as the Palestinians have their voice and their issues, so the Sephardi from the Arab world have similar issues, and that one can't talk about one without the other. It's not to discount the Palestinians, but it's to raise and elevate the voice of the Sephardi. So why I mentioned Ilyana is because Ilyana is a Cuban refugee. And so Cuban refugees, I come from Miami, this is where I live, understand what it means to live under these regimes. And so my goal, my work these days is to try to have the American government be much more a stronger advocate, even in terms of the Sephardi from the Arab world, and in the process of that, to help build a wider net of the Abraham Accords, because the Sephardi can help in doing that, and in the process also try to raise the consciousness of the Ashkenazi so that they celebrate and honor the Sephardi through Yom HaPlitim.
What would justice look like, do you think? You mentioned you can't talk about one refugee crisis without talking about the other in terms of the Palestinians and the Jewish refugees from Arab lands. Yossi Klein Halevi was on the show a couple of weeks ago, and he's made the point that there should be reparations for Palestinians, but also reparations for Jews who were expelled. Is that what you're looking for, or is it more recognition?
So the person who is my mentor and the one who really helps all of us think through this is a person named Irwin Cutler. Irwin Cutler was Mandela's lawyer. He was the Justice Minister of Canada, and he's now the chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center. And he talks about it as truth and justice. And he uses South Africa in a way of addressing it because it's a recognition of everyone that it's about truth and justice. One needs to know both stories, and then it has to be justice for both. And in the process of doing that, if you're going to have reparations, then it's reparations for both. It's inclusive. That's my point. And it's one in which the justice is not an overnight situation. It's one of process, and it involves education, and it involves understanding the truth behind these stories. You've got to get away from the propaganda, from the 30-second social platforms, the false news, and deal with truth.
You've got a new book in the works, right? The Forgotten Exodus of Arab Jews. What is in that? What argument are you making there that you haven't made yet?
Okay, so what Sephardi Voices, the Untold Expulsion of Jews from Arab Lands that I published in 21 was with Richard Sturzberg, who is also the chair of the board of Sephardi Voices. That was really taking, a few of the stories and then of the hundreds and hundreds and seaming it together with a narrative, with the portraits we take of each individual and many, many, many of the documents that they have given us. And that collection is now at the National Library of Israel and free and accessible. The book that you're referring to, which will be coming out shortly, is where forensics has been done on what is the size of the assets that were lost. The synagogues, the centers, the cemeteries, people's property, their businesses. And so each country has been looked at forensically in terms of the data. And then a little history has been put in front of that so one understands how it applies to each country, so that you end up with a total, as it were, of what the assets were and the amount. And it's I don't remember off my head if it's 250 billion or it's 260 billion or something, but whatever that number is, that's part of what would be the discussion if you were going to have reparations. But this will then be added to our presentation in Geneva in September, because this then becomes the evidence-based data that one works with in terms of the discussions and moving forward for truth and justice.
How has the reception been at the UN Human Rights Council? Right.
It's there it goes. Your words is the reception. Yeah, it's the United Nations is made up of about 25% of Arab countries, and so you don't have much ability to get any wind. But I do think there's many ways of doing this. I mean, I do think that by people like Ileana, they understand the story. And so it's how do we build networks in various kinds of ways. I live in Miami. Let's use Miami as an example. It's not from the top down as much as from the bottom up, because you have people in Spanish Morocco. Okay, they left, they went to Venezuela. They speak Spanish. Venezuela's going through problems now. They come to Miami. They then are living in Doral, which is a neighborhood that's more Venezuelan. So they're talking to each other about their experience, and now they're bringing their experience from the Arab world into this conversation of this is a second trauma for us. This is what I think it's about. It's how you build personal networks. And from those personal networks, we understand that each of us are a brother, if we could put it in that kind of way. And the experiences are similar. And then we have stronger advocacy groups because we understand what it's about. It's about truth and justice. And we then work together, and we are much, much more empowering in what we can do. And if we can bring that into educational systems, even better.
Do you think the Abraham Accords and expanding the Abraham Accords will lead to any more recognition of the Jewish exodus among Arab countries?
I think that in certain countries it's more likely than other countries. Morocco, for example. So if you have, if we're able to do it with another country, let's say, then you're going to have more contact between those two countries. Jewish merchants are going to go between those two countries. You're going to build bigger networks. And it slowly grows. It's like you plant a seed. You don't see the blossoms immediately, but you start seeing the buds. And then the blossoms in maybe another generation. And so let me give you just another simple example. The Holocaust ended in 1945. I was not brought up where the Holocaust was taught in my Jewish schools. No one taught about it. And then Elie Wiesel writes a book called Night. And all of a sudden, people are starting to read about the Holocaust. Okay? That's one generation later, 1967. Still, though, you really don't have the impact yet of collecting stories, of building what we have today. How did that happen? Spielberg made a movie called Schindler's List. And out of that came 52,000 interviews. Okay? Now that's another generation later. I think what my role is that first stage of just planting the seeds. And then hoping that other people will water it. I think what you're doing, Ben, is one amazing example of that, because you're reaching out to so many people and you're saying, let's help Henry water.
So many stories that need to be heard here, and so many stories I wish we could have gotten to talk about. I could have talked all night. The guy who rolls himself in a carpet to go visit his parents and find a wife, and then they have to be rolled in a carpet to then leave Iran. These are amazing stories. Where can people learn more?
The best way is either go to SephardiVoices.com, which is our website, but to really get a handle on it all, go to the National Library of Israel, look up Sephardi Voices. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of interviews, portraits that they can then follow up on.
Henry Green, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Right at the end of our conversation, Dr. Green told me about a student, the president of the campus, Hillel, killing time before an event, scrolling the Sephardi Voices website, and there, a photograph of her own great aunt, and then her grandparents. Faces she'd never seen. She started to cry. Dr. Green called it the kesher, the connection. He said her tears were like seeds she wanted to replant. And that's what this whole project is. A civilization of 2,500 years down to fewer than 10,000 Jews in the Arab world today. And a handful of people trying to make sure the story doesn't vanish with them. You plant a seed, you don't see the blossoms right away, but you do start to see the buds. Dr. Henry Green is the founder of Sephardi Voices and a professor at the University of Miami. His archive is free and open at the National Library of Israel. Links to his work are in the description. If you're not already, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. And if you like what you heard here, do me a favor, take 30 seconds and write us a review. It helps get this podcast in front of other people. Follow Honest Reporting on Instagram, X, TikTok, and Facebook. I'm Ben Chertoff. This is The Honest Take, and we'll see you next time.